A submarine can spend more than 3 decades at sea, diving, surfacing, deploying, coming home, without a single trip to refuel its reactor. That's how the U.S. Navy and the Naval Sea Systems Command say the Virginia-class attack submarine is built to run. Its reactor core is designed to power the boat for its entire planned service life, roughly 33 years, without a mid-life refueling overhaul. Nobody cuts open the pressure hull halfway through its career. There's no multi-year shipyard stay just to swap nuclear fuel. The submarine goes to sea, comes home, gets maintained, and goes back out again for its whole operational life on the same core it was built with. That one design decision changed how the Navy thinks about submarine readiness. To see why, you have to know what submarines used to require and what changed. This video walks through what a life-of-the-ship reactor core actually is, how the Navy and its contractors made it possible, and why older submarine classes like the Los Angeles class needed something the Virginia class doesn't, a nuclear refueling overhaul partway through their working lives. We'll also look at where this design choice stands today, what it cost, and what's still genuinely argued about. Start with the basic mechanics, because life-of-the-ship reactor gets thrown around a lot without much explanation of what's actually inside the hull. Every U.S. Navy nuclear submarine runs on a pressurized water reactor, a sealed primary loop of water, kept under extreme pressure so it can't boil, carries heat away from the core. That superheated water passes its heat to a secondary loop, which turns to steam, which spins a turbine, which turns the propeller shaft and drives the ship's generators. The reactor sits in a shielded compartment and the core, the assembly of nuclear fuel sustaining the chain reaction, is what determines how long the submarine can run before it needs new fuel. Here's the part that isn't obvious from the outside. How long a core lasts isn't fixed by physics alone. It's an engineering choice, driven mostly by how enriched the uranium fuel is and how the core is physically arranged. A more highly enriched core packs more potential energy into the same space, so it can run the reactor longer before the fuel runs out and needs replacing. I went through the Navy's own public fact sheets and NAVSEA's Virginia-class documentation while putting this together, and one thing stood out. The Navy doesn't talk about the life-of-the-ship core mainly as a technical flex. It frames it as a fleet availability problem that had been quietly draining resources for decades. That framing explains a lot about why the investment happened. Rewind to the submarine fleet the Navy actually ran through the late 20th century. The Los Angeles class, commissioned starting in the 1970s and built in large numbers through the 1990s, was the backbone of the U.S. attack submarine fleet for a generation. Those boats didn't have life-of-the-ship cores. Partway through their service lives, many Los Angeles-class submarines went through a refueling overhaul, a shipyard period where the reactor compartment was opened, the depleted fuel removed, and a new core installed, along with other major maintenance bundled into the same yard stay. That's not a quick job. Refueling a submarine reactor means cutting into the pressure hull in a controlled, heavily regulated process, physically accessing the reactor vessel, removing spent fuel under strict radiological safety procedures, then reassembling and recertifying the hull. Congressional Research Service reporting and Navy budget submissions over the years describe these overhauls as multi-year shipyard periods, commonly 2 to 4 years, that pull a submarine completely out of the fleet while the work happens, on top of being a major line item in the Navy's shipbuilding and maintenance accounts. Multiply that across dozens of Los Angeles-class boats, and you get a recurring, predictable drain. Submarines that could otherwise be deployed, training, or standing ready instead sat in a shipyard for years, waiting to get their reactor cores replaced. That's the problem the life-of-the-ship core was built to solve, and solving it wasn't simple. A core with enough fuel margin to last 30-plus years, while still fitting inside a submarine-sized reactor compartment and meeting the Navy's safety and shielding requirements, needed a substantial jump in uranium enrichment compared to earlier designs, plus core arrangements developed by the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, the Joint Navy and Department of Energy organization historically tied to Admiral Hyman Rickover that has designed and certified every U.S. naval reactor since the 1950s. The specifics of naval reactor fuel enrichment and core design stay classified, but the Navy has been open for decades about the general fact that its submarine and carrier reactors run on highly enriched uranium. That's exactly what lets a core hold enough energy to last decades between refuelings. The Virginia class was the first U.S. attack submarine class built from the ground up around this life-of-the-ship approach. The lead boat, USS Virginia, was commissioned in 2004, and the class has been in continuous production since, built jointly by General Dynamics Electric Boat and Huntington Ingalls Newport News Shipbuilding, delivered in successive design increments the Navy calls blocks. Each one adds capability. The newest, Block V, runs noticeably longer than earlier blocks because it adds the Virginia Payload Module, a mid-body section carrying 4 extra large-diameter missile tubes. So the Navy solved the refueling problem. What did that actually buy them? Mostly, time at sea instead of time in the yard. A Virginia-class submarine still needs scheduled maintenance throughout its life. No warship goes 30 years without any yard time. But those stops are for general upkeep, not the long, expensive process of cracking open the hull to swap nuclear fuel. The Navy says that translates into more of each submarine's service life actually available for operations, patrols, deployments, exercises, the kind of persistent presence that gives commanders options. There's a cost angle too. Cutting a scheduled multi-year refueling overhaul out of an entire submarine class removes a recurring budget expense the Navy would otherwise plan for repeatedly, boat after boat, decade after decade. The Navy and NAVSEA have both pointed to that avoided cost, alongside the added fleet availability, as central reasons for the life of the ship core investment. What strikes me about this decision is how unglamorous it is next to most naval headlines. No missile test, no confrontation at sea, no dramatic incident behind it. It's a metallurgy and fuel enrichment call made years before a single Virginia-class hull touched water, and it quietly changed how many submarines the Navy effectively has available at any moment without adding one new hull to the fleet. That's worth sitting with. A fleet readiness gain that looks, on paper, almost like building more submarines, achieved instead by changing what's inside the ones already there. Most people who hear the reactor never needs refueling assume the submarine itself lasts forever, or that the tech could just be bolted onto any reactor design. Neither is right. The submarine still has a defined service life, around 33 years, after which the hull, the systems, and eventually the fuel margin all hit their designed limits. And a life of the ship core isn't a universal fix. It's a trade-off with real costs attached, which is where this story stops being purely technical. Here's the part that gets discussed far less than the engineering achievement. Highly enriched uranium is also, by definition, the same category of material that matters most for nuclear weapons proliferation. Naval reactor fuel is enriched well above what commercial power reactors use, and while the U.S. Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program has an extremely tight security and safeguards record. Arms control researchers and groups like the Arms Control Association have pointed out for years that every country that builds a longer life, higher enrichment naval reactor sets a precedent, and that precedent reaches beyond the country doing it. That debate went public with the AUKUS submarine program, where the United States and United Kingdom are helping Australia field nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed, attack submarines using this kind of highly enriched naval fuel. Non-proliferation specialists and the International Atomic Energy Agency itself have flagged that handing weapons-grade level naval fuel to a non-nuclear weapon state, even for entirely legitimate propulsion under international agreements, creates a monitoring problem the global non-proliferation regime wasn't originally built to handle cleanly. Here's a take that'll probably draw some pushback. The life of the ship reactor is, without question, a real engineering and readiness win for the U.S. submarine fleet. But treating it as a clean technical success story with no downstream cost misses a real, unresolved tension. Every additional country that adopts this approach to naval propulsion makes the international safeguard system's job measurably harder, and that's a cost that almost never shows up in the public conversation about these submarines. So here's a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Does the operational and cost benefit of a life of the ship reactor core outweigh the proliferation risk of spreading highly enriched naval fuel technology to more countries? Or should that trade-off weigh more heavily than it currently does in how these programs get approved? I'd genuinely like to know where you land on that. Set the debate aside for a second, because there's a narrower, more contained obstacle worth mentioning. It explains why this technology took as long as it did to reach the fleet. Building a core with enough margin to last 3 decades isn't just about cranking up enrichment. Engineers also have to account for how the fuel and core structure hold up under decades of neutron bombardment, heat cycling, and mechanical stress, without ever being able to physically inspect or replace parts along the way a scheduled refueling would allow. Get that margin wrong in either direction, and you either waste enormous cost building and more fuel than needed, or risk a core that can't reliably make it to the boat's planned retirement. That's a certification challenge the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program spent years working through before the Virginia-class design was finalized. Where does this stand today? The Virginia-class remains in active production, now well into its later design blocks, with the Virginia payload module variant adding significant missile capacity to newer hulls. The Navy has said publicly that it intends to eventually replace the aging Los Angeles-class boats entirely with Virginia-class and successor submarines, partly because of this availability advantage. Meanwhile, the Navy's next-generation attack submarine program, often called SSN-X in public, is expected to build on life-of-the-ship reactor design principles, though the Navy has released comparatively little detail about that program's reactor choices. What's confirmed? The life-of-the-ship reactor core exists, is deployed across the in-service Virginia-class fleet, and is officially described by the Navy and NAVSEA as eliminating the need for a mid-life refueling overhaul. What's less publicly detailed, the exact enrichment levels, core composition, and certification methodology, all classified for understandable security reasons. And the precise dollar figures the Navy has avoided spending fleet-wide, which vary across different budget documents and haven't been rolled up into one official, citable total. One detail that stuck with me while researching this: the Navy doesn't describe the life-of-the-ship core as a single invention with a clean origin story. Multiple official sources describe it as the product of a program, the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program, that's been incrementally extending core life across generations of submarines for decades, with the Virginia-class simply marking the point where that curve crossed long enough to cover the entire planned service life. Less a breakthrough moment, more a threshold quietly crossed. So next time you hear that a Virginia-class submarine can run for over 3 decades without ever refueling its reactor, that's not a marketing line. It's a documented design outcome of a fuel and core engineering effort aimed at keeping submarines at sea instead of in a shipyard. It also comes with trade-offs that rarely make the same headline. Cost avoided on one side of the ledger, a harder non-proliferation picture on the other, especially as more countries adopt similar naval reactor technology through programs like AUKUS. If you want to dig further into naval propulsion, how earlier submarine classes refueling overhauls actually worked, or how the AUKUS deal is reshaping the global non-proliferation conversation. That's a natural next stop, and there's a lot more in the public record than made it into this video. What do you think? Is a longer-lasting, higher-enrichment naval reactor a straightforward engineering win, or does the non-proliferation trade-off deserve more weight in how these programs get built and shared? Comment YES if you think it's worth it, or no if you think the trade-off is underrated. We read every comment.